Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is part 2, 50 greatest historical events that never happened. Ear itches. Stockbroker jumping out of windows. Okay. So, there's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. All donations are appreciated. You can subscribe if, I put something out that you like. And bare minimum, give me a thumbs up. That helps with YouTube algorithms and stuff. You ready? Part 2.
Jumping out of windows. The 1920s was a great time to be in the stock market. The market was experiencing a speculative bubble, inflating stock prices to completely unreasonable heights. However, as investors were reminded in the years 2000, 2008, 2015, and 2018, to name just a few, these speculative bubbles always burst. In October of 1929, the first stock market crash began. Between Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market dropped over 23%. This was not an isolated incident, and the market had already been in sharp decline, but it remains the largest two-day drop in history. People were panicked, and stockbrokers began jumping out of windows to end their own lives as they crashed headfirst into Wall Street, just like their stocks had. It was even said that there were lines of brokers waiting for a free window. This was the initial reporting in newspapers, and comedians quickly jumped onto the story to help perpetuate the rumors. However, there is not a single verified instance of this actually happening. While the Great Depression did see higher suicide rates than the 1920s had, there was no sudden spike in October of 1929. Most people accepted that the world had gone to chose to do their best to survive. The stockbrokers never jumped out of the window. Let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France before the French Revolution, and the revolution did not end well for her or her husband, King Louis XVI. They were both beheaded after an angry
I was going to say, well, it depends on who you ask, I guess.
populace removed them from power. Of all the stories of Marie Antoinette, none is more famous than when she was informed that the peasants had no bread to eat. She was reported as saying, "Let them eat cake." However, there's no evidence that she actually ever said this, nor is it even a proper translation of the quote people have attributed to her, though the sentiment is largely the same. In French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography, he made reference to an unnamed princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, replied, "Qu'ils mangeaient de la brioche." This translates to "let them eat brioche," which is a fancier, sweeter bread, but still, it's a bread, it's not cake. However, while not published until 1782, Rousseau is said to have completed the book in 1767, 3 years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. In reality, stories like this had existed for centuries in different languages all across the world. It was just a joke meant to show how out of touch the ruling class were with the people over who they were supposed to be ruling. Martin Luther's 95 Theses. On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther walked to the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. It was a bold act of defiance that kicked off the Reformation and Luther's split from the Catholic Church. At least, that was what we've been led to believe. But it didn't quite go down like that. It is believed that Luther never nailed his theses to the church doors. He simply mailed them to the archbishop. Luther was a priest and a devout Catholic, and he wasn't looking to form his own religion just to fix the church. His main issue was with the practice of indulgences, the church's way of raising money by telling people they could buy their way into heaven. His complaints were ignored, and things spiraled out of control.
They still do that today. Speaking of, if you guys want to send some money my way, I can guarantee you a spot in heaven for $199 every month. I will guarantee you a spot.
Resulting in Luther's excommunication. Historians agree that the theses were never nailed to the church door, particularly because Luther was a bit of a braggart, but he never claimed to have done this, only saying that he mailed them to the archbishop. However, even if it had happened, it wouldn't have been the grandiose display that it was made out to be. Church doors were essentially the city bulletin board, and people nailed documents to them all the time so that they would be seen by most people. Lady Godiva's Ride. Lady Godiva was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, in the 11th century. She felt pity for the peasants and the oppressive taxes her husband imposed on them, so she continually pleaded with him to lower their tax burden. Finally, sick of hearing her ask, Leofric told her that he would lower taxes if she rode through the streets naked on a horse. To his surprise, She agreed. Out of respect for Lady Godiva and what she was doing for them, all of the people of the city remained indoors during her ride except for one. That man, a tailor named Tom, gave us the expression Peeping Tom. The story is so iconic that it inspired multiple paintings and sculptures by famous artists, but there's actually no evidence that it ever happens. This story wasn't first recorded until over 2 centuries after her death, making it virtually impossible to have happened. Though Godiva and Leofric were real people, contemporary historians made no reference to Godiva other than her being married to an earl and her considerable donations to the church. If a famous naked ride took place, it seems like the sort of thing that they might have mentioned. Eureka! Archimedes was a Greek mathematician and scientist who was well known during his time. He was summoned by King Hero II of Syracuse to inspect a crown that had been commissioned. Hero had supplied the gold for the crown, but he wanted Archimedes to determine if the gold had been adulterated with cheaper metals like silver. The only caveat was that Archimedes could not damage the crown, which was likely in the shape of a wreath. Although this question would be easily answered if Archimedes knew the weight and volume of the crown, its highly irregular shape made calculating the volume a difficult problem. Archimedes went home to soak in the bath and think about the problem, and when he saw the water level in the bath rise as he sat down, he realized he could use the displacement of the water to measure the crown's volume. He then jumped out of the bath and ran naked through the streets yelling Eureka, excited that he could answer the king's question. While this story does appear in ancient historical accounts such as the work of Vitruvius, the story is still somewhat apocryphal. Archimedes certainly could have solved such a problem for King Hero, but running naked through the streets was likely a playful embellishment added by the historians. From a logical standpoint, he is also more likely to have used Archimedes' principle of buoyancy rather than the displacement of water, as the latter would have required measurements that were impractically precise given the technology at the time. Archimedes' death ray. There are many apocryphal stories about Archimedes, but the other most famous one involves the siege of Syracuse during the First Punic War. During the siege, it was said that Archimedes used a series of large mirrors to focus the light from the sun onto oncoming Roman ships, setting them ablaze while they were still in the water. This has been referred to both as Archimedes' heat ray and his death ray. It's a popular story that lines up with people's belief about the brilliant inventor. However, the earliest references to this death ray came 4 centuries after the war. Even then, it was only stated that Archimedes set fire to the boats, and the author didn't specify how. Still, the theory seemed somewhat plausible, and numerous attempts have been made to create this event using only materials that would have been available at the time. Despite the best efforts of Mythbusters and other teams trying to recreate Archimedes' invention, they have been universally unsuccessful. Even though it's theoretically possible that it could work, the logistics of aiming the mirrors perfectly at a moving target make it incredibly unlikely that this really happened. Archimedes was killed during the siege by the Romans, so if he did have some clever way to make his death ray work, then the plans died with him. William Tell's apple. Everyone has heard the famous story of William Tell and the apple, but for the people of Switzerland, it's much more than that. The legend goes that after refusing to remove his hat, the tyrannical Habsburg bailiff Albrecht Gessler ordered Tell to shoot an apple off of his son's head at a distance of 120 paces. If he failed, they would both be put to death. Tell loaded his crossbow, counted out 120 paces, and then fired, taking the apple clear off of his son's head. When Gessler asked why there was a second arrow in his jacket, Tell said that if he killed his son, he would have killed Gessler next. This is the part most people know, but the story goes on from there, with Tell being imprisoned, escaping, assassinating Gessler, and helping lead the rebellion that led to the formation of the Old Swiss Confederacy. Naturally, Tell became a national hero, but there's one problem. Not only is this story a complete fabrication, there's no evidence that Tell actually even existed. The first account of this story was written hundreds of years after it happened, and the author got the date wrong by 16 years. If that wasn't damning enough, another story, written over 300 years before this allegedly took place, was written by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and a man named Palnatoke. It's nearly the exact same story, with Palnatoke and Bluetooth taking the roles of Tell and Gessler. Death by ham sandwich. Cass Elliot, also known as Mama Cass, was a beloved member of the 1960s group The Mamas and the Papas, as well as an accomplished solo artist. And the story goes that she died choking on a ham sandwich. It's such a well-known tale that it was even joked about in Austin Powers. However, while we know that this was not Cass's true cause of death, it wasn't a total fabrication. When Dr. Anthony Greenberg saw Cass's body in the room where she had died, his first instinct was that she died of asphyxiation. He noted that she'd been lying down while eating a ham sandwich and drinking a Coke, which he deemed a dangerous activity, especially for someone overweight. His initial analysis was that she had choked to death from the sandwich. The public immediately latched onto this story because it was deemed a humorous cause of death. Cass's weight had made her the constant butt of people's jokes, and this fit the narrative that they had constructed around her perfectly. So much so that few people took notice when her actual cause of death was revealed after her autopsy. Though it was related to her weight, Cass did not die die choking on a sandwich. She had been consistently overweight, but also routinely went on dangerous crash diets to lose weight for photo shoots and the like. The combination of these crash diets and being generally overweight put a tremendous amount of strain on her body, and she died of a heart attack. She just happened to coincidentally be eating a ham sandwich when that happened. The original vampire. Prince of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, is often referred to as the world's first vampire. While vampire legends predated Vlad, vampires obviously aren't real, whereas Vlad was, allowing him to earn this title. Vlad was a brutal and ruthless leader, known for impaling his enemies on spikes. He is often cited as drinking the blood of his enemies as well, with the somewhat toned-down version of the story being that he would walk among the impaled bodies while eating dinner, dipping his bread in their blood. Since Vlad was such a feared ruler and was famous for his cruelty and brutality, it's easy to see how this rumor would have spread. Even if it wasn't true, it would certainly be to his benefit if everyone believed it. Modern historians have always questioned how realistic this story was, with it being dismissed as legend and hyperbole. However, new research may have provided a definitive and somewhat shocking answer. According to the study published in 2023, Vlad definitively did not drink any blood, human or animal. In fact, he was probably a vegetarian. Skin and saliva samples were taken from a letter written by Vlad, and expert analysis showed a complete lack of animal proteins. This would only be possible if Vlad was a vegetarian or possibly even vegan. Of course, that surprising fact doesn't make him any less brutal. Oscar Wilde's last words.
So he was a vegetable vampire. That's right.
Oscar Wilde was impoverished and in poor health for his last few years. The end of his life was spent confined to his bed in room 16 in the Hôtel d'Alsace in Saint-Amand-de-Pré, Paris, before he finally died from meningitis. On his deathbed, it's said that Wilde spoke his final words to a friend, author, and journalist Claire de Prats. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." It's a good line, and complaining about the aesthetics of his dreary hotel room while dying certainly seemed to fit Wilde's personality. Last words are notoriously difficult to verify. However, this story is most likely only a slight exaggeration. Prats wrote that Wilde spoke these words to her, but not on his deathbed. Instead, she said that he made this remark weeks before his death during one of his final trips outside his hotel room. So while it is likely that Wilde said the famous quote attributed to him, the idea of them being his last words were a later embellishment to make the story more interesting. The Betsy Ross flag. The original...
Anybody else think that they're going to have some really cool final words? I want mine to just be weird. You know? Just... I don't want them to make sense. I want my last words to be something like, "Why do your feet smell like coleslaw?" Like that. That's what I want. I want everyone to go... Yeah. Did you know what his last words were, though? Made no sense. It was really weird. I'm actually glad he's dead now, after hearing that. What do you want your final words to be? Leave them in the comments. That just don't die after you've said them.
First American flag, featuring 13 stars and stripes, is often referred to as the Betsy Ross flag in honor of its creator. Elizabeth Ross was a Philadelphia seamstress who had sewn flags during the American Revolution and in the decades that followed, and she was personally commissioned by George Washington to create the design for the first official United States flag. This is an iconic story about the founding of the United States, and Betsy Ross sewing the original flag was even immortalized on a US stamp. However, virtually every part of this story is fiction. Betsy Ross really did spend 50 years sewing flags, mostly for the military, but there's no evidence she designed the so-called Betsy Ross flag. Even if she had, it was actually the second official flag rather than the first. The original story, as told by her family, was that Washington had a sketch of the design that he wanted, and that Ross's only design contribution was to switch from 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars, as they'd be easier to manufacture. This evolved over time into her designing the entire flag. While her grandson may have believed the more humble family lore he presented of Ross only changing the shape of the stars, most people spreading this story knew that it was entirely fictional. But when her grandson came forward with the story, it was just after the Civil War leading up to the nation's centennial celebration. There was a strong desire to create wholesome American lore that could help unite the nation, so the story was publicized with no regard given to its veracity. Burned at the stake. The Salem witch trials are a well-known part of American history, and every Halloween, nearly 1 million tourists come to see the city where it all went down and make traffic miserable for everybody else. It began when two young girls, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, began experiencing fits symptomatic of bewitchment. They named the witches, who they believed to be casting spells on them, and the witches were burned at the stake. This set off a cascade of events in which dozens of innocent people were executed after being accused of witchcraft by young girls. While this is how most people remember it, it's not exactly what happened. To start, most of these events didn't actually take place in modern-day Salem. The trials were primarily held in Salem town, which is now Salem, but the people involved were all in Salem village, which is present-day Danvers. More importantly, nobody was burned at the stake. This mistake is likely the result of confusion more than anything else. Witch trials occurred throughout Europe as well, and in Europe it was customary for the witches to be burnt. In Salem, however, the standard method of execution was hanging. Of course, this ultimately worked out better for the town of Salem. Burning the victims wouldn't have left any meaningful landmarks, but Gallows Hill is now a popular stop for tourists. War of the Worlds. On October the 30th, 1938, CBS...
For people who don't know about the Salem witch trials, the governor... He was all for weeding out these witches. You know, we got to get rid of them. We got to kill them. And then one of those little girls named his wife as, like, coming to her in the middle of the night as a witch and blah, 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 and so named her. And so she was to be put on trial, and the governor was like, all right, we're done with this. And it's like, no, wait a second. You've allowed all these other people to be killed. Why is it now suddenly we're crossing that line and it's not cool anymore? Like, So he was the reason why it ended, because, you know, he didn't want his wife put on trial.
Radio decided to air a very special Halloween broadcast. Live on air, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre were going to read a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells's famous novel War of the Worlds. The show was written in the style of a news broadcast, so it opened with a disclaimer.
Real fast, when I was in school, we heard the broadcast. It played out, and we had a little book that we could read along with it. It was pretty cool.
What was being presented was a fictional radio play rather than a breaking news bulletin. However, not everybody caught that announcement. The fake newscast was airing alongside the Chase and Sanborn Hour, a popular show that had only become more of a hit with the addition of ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy. Because ventriloquism apparently translates amazingly well to radio. After the first comedy sketch, there was a musical number, and many listeners changed stations to CBS, having missed the initial disclaimer. This resulted in widespread panic. Depending on how much of the show people heard before losing their they believed either there was a major natural disaster, an invasion from the Germans, or an actual Martian invasion. That's how newspapers reported it anyway. But it was all a lie. Radio news had been rapidly gaining popularity, and it was stealing advertising revenue from print newspapers. In an ironic twist of fate, the newspapers decided to use the fictional news drama to paint radio news as untrustworthy by knowingly printing their own lies. Newton and the Apple. Isaac Newton was enjoying a peaceful day in his garden at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, England. As he sat beneath an apple tree, an apple fell off the tree and landed directly on his head. The sudden impact turned Newton's thoughts to that of gravitation, an attractive force that pulled things down toward the Earth. It's a well-known story, though even children assume that it's apocryphal when they hear it. The idea that Newton's laws were derived merely by being bonked on the head with an apple sounds too preposterous to be true. However, it's not actually that far off the real story. The story dates back to a biography of Newton that had been written by one of his friends, and the story about the apple was told to him directly by Newton. Though he never claimed that the apple hit him on the head, an apple was indeed the inspiration for his work with gravity. Rather than being struck by the apple, Newton merely observed an apple fall within his line of sight. It got him wondering why an apple falling from a tree would always fall straight down towards the earth rather than at an angle or even instead of falling upwards. The idea of an apple falling up obviously sounded ludicrous, but without Newton explaining how gravity worked, there was no real scientific explanation as to why. Battle of Thermopylae.
There was she was a really stupid woman. Not all, just this one in particular, who said that Isaac Newton should be ashamed of himself for, get ready for this, inventing gravity, and that we don't need gravity because the moon ain't got no gravity. So she didn't know why one person invented it and now forced it upon us. Yeah, that was... She said that. I'll try to find that short sometime. I might pause the end of the video and then try to find it, just so you can see it.
knows the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was one of the most famous battles of ancient times and was immortalized in the comic book and subsequent movie 300. During the battle, 300 Spartans stood alone against a Persian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Persians would have to travel through the bottlenecked pass of Thermopylae, effectively negating their numbers advantage. The battle lasted for 3 days until the Spartans were dead to the last man, but with 20,000 Persian deaths, Xerxes decided to withdraw his army rather than pressing onward to engage a larger Spartan army. It's an incredible story that demonstrates both the skill of Spartan soldiers and the importance of battle tactics, but while the basic idea of the story is true, it is a complete exaggeration. Herodotus recorded the battle as having 4,000 Greek deaths, something that would be impossible if there were only 300 men there at the start. A Greek army of roughly 7,000 men fought against the Persians for 2 full days. After the second day, Leonidas learned that the Persians had found an alternate path and were moving to flank them, so he dismissed much of the Greek army. Though only 300 Spartans remained for the final day of the battle, another 2,000 Greek soldiers stayed as well. The Greeks also didn't all fight to their deaths, as it was reported that most of the 400 Thebans eventually surrendered to the Persian army. It was still impressive that the Greek army was able to hold the position successfully as long as they did, but the story has been exaggerated over time to depict the Spartans as effectively superhuman. Chastity belts. We can all imagine the scene so vividly. It's the Middle Ages, and you start to get frisky with some comely lass, but as you lift up her frock, you suddenly find yourself face to face with a chastity belt, padlocked shut by either a father to prevent premarital sex or a husband to prevent infidelity while he's off at war. It looks like you're going to have to settle for another night of medieval hand stuff. It's an extremely common depiction that has existed for centuries, and it's entirely fictional. The idea that chastity belts were common in the Middle Ages seems to have taken hold in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not because there was any evidence that they existed, just because the idea of a chastity belt made their ancestors seem backwards and repressed, making them come off as much more enlightened by comparison. While some references to chastity belts exist from the Middle Ages, they are exceedingly rare. Any references that do exist are either metaphorical or satirical in nature, and there are no actual chastity belts from the time period that have ever been found. The earliest known sketch of one of these devices is from a book written in 1405, which at first suggests that they may have existed. However, this book also has sketches of devices to make the wearer invisible and is filled with fart jokes, so it's hard to believe that this sketch wasn't also just a joke. Atlantis. The lost city of Atlantis was a utopian society located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, whatever that means. They were an advanced naval empire controlling nearly all western portions of the known world. Then, after a failed attempt to conquer Athens, the Atlanteans fell out of favor with the gods and their island was cast into the sea. Most people understand that this was fiction, but some of the nuance has caused a lot of confusion. To start, there are still those that believe Atlantis was a real place and have dedicated their lives to finding it. To those people, we wish them the best of luck in their endeavor. But as for those of us who are aware there was never an Atlantis, how important this piece of fiction was often gets misunderstood. Despite its fame and notoriety, the story of Atlantis was a relatively minor aspect of 2 books written by Plato. There was not some rich oral tradition about this lost city, nor was Atlantis a major part of the public consciousness at the time. It was simply an allegory that Plato invented to try and prove a point, though exactly what his point was remains a matter of considerable debate. Dr. Seuss's most...
Okay, we're going to end it there. Been another 19 minutes, and then we'll finish up the last part. Be 17-ish. Well, 18, we'll call it. Okay. Dr. Seuss's most famous quote. I don't know what that is. It's not the Cat in the Hat. That's a Dr. That's a... Okay. Okay, so we're going to end this here. I hope you found these no, we're not going to. No, we're not going to, are we? No, we are not. No, we're not. I'm going to find that video. Hold on. Okay, here's that video. And woman says we don't need gravity. So let's enlarge it. And here we go.
My titties are low thanks to gravity.
Yay! A personal anecdote.
Can we just also say we don't actually need gravity? Like, we actually don't need it.
What do you mean that we don't need gravity?
What if it was never invented?
Invented by who?
Sir Isaac Newton.
Isaac Newton created gravity?
Who created gravity, babe? Dan?
What do you mean we don't need gravity? I'm curious about that
We just
statement.
don't need it.
But, like, what do you mean?
The moon doesn't have gravity.
It does.
Literally don't know what you're talking about. Like,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
literally checked out of this conversation.
Who cares about space and gravity?
Literally, who does though?
Who
Like,
cares? We don't need gravity.
I have no interest in gravity.
I just feel like it's important to understand the world you live in. That you have to know what gravity is.
Okay, well, you should know Sutton Foster, and you don't know her, so what?
You're right.
Musical theater icon legend.
I feel like gravity has more relevance in our daily life than
Where's Gravity's award show? Like nobody cares. No one's giving out
I can't
awards
believe
for
this
Gravity.
conversation about
I
gravity.
can't believe you're such a nerd that you care this much about Gravity. Nobody cares. I don't care. Audience doesn't care. Nobody in this room cares.
Wow.
I'm over this.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Oh my god.
Let's burn. We're almost there.
Yeah.
We're almost
Okay,
there.
the hour's almost up. Thank God.
I want you to think about that when you go to sleep tonight, and think that there are people like that who exist, that think that Sir Isaac Newton invented gravity and forced it onto us. We're all dumber right now. Every single one of us. You just lost so many brain cells, and you'll never get them back. In fact, that was time away from your life that you'll never get back. That was a minute 21. You'll never get back. How do you feel now? Okay. Oh boy. Okay. So I'm not even going to put a link to this video in my other link. This is just going to be if I had to know it existed, now you do too. So we're going to end this here. And until part 3, have a good day, have a good night.